thank you for inviting me. I always have a great pleasure to speak before Chamber of Commerce because I have more time to speak, only 40 minutes or so, and you're a great audience. I will be speaking today on rational believers in Alaska. It's sort of, I call them our Alaskan Amish group. And I was introduced to rational believers in 1983 or so. In 1981, I did my field work in South Central Alaska as an archaeologist. And Alaska then in the 1980s was closed for the Soviets, as you remember. It was Siberia was closed for many Americans, and Alaska was closed for the Soviet citizens. And I was the first Soviet-born speaker in Russian in Alaska, but somebody said there is a group, of conservative group in the Kenai Peninsula of the Russians. So I come back to my school, Brown University, and I wrote a proposal because I was interested in ethnoarchaeology. And of course I submitted my transcript from the Soviet Union. I went to Kiev Pedagogical Institute. Of course I studied history of communism and scientific atheism and all these ism subjects. And I kind of, in an innocent way, I sent my resume to Nikolaevsk village, and the response was a couple of weeks later to my school and to my dean, the Department of Anthropology, is that Mr. Dalitsky is a full-fledged Marxist and non-communist, and we don't want him around. Well, that obviously mistake was mine because I shouldn't submit my transcript from the Soviet Union that had so many offensive subjects to this group. But then later in 1983, I did a field work in the Kenai Peninsula doing archaeology in Kodiak, and then near the Russian campground, there's a Russian river, Kenai River. And I had some time, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to visit Old Believers. And in fact, with my assistant or another friend, we stopped a car just in the entrance to the village. And I said, well, keep the car running in case if I run, then we just basically will not welcome. We will just walk away. But I was received very well by Basargin and Martushev, who were just standing there, and they introduced me to the village, and that's how we started. So basically, my studies of Russian Old Believers started in 1983. Then I visited them several times in 85, 86, 88. A couple of times in the 90s, and took quite unique pictures that this year at least one student from Berkeley University was interested in those photographs, information that I got. I recorded several of them, and then National Geographic, and one freelancer from Internet. Yeah, so I started studying Russian Old Believers, also visited Russian Old Believers in Siberia and Transbaikal area later on, and in Altai Mountains, northern Mongolia, Bukhtarmin Old Believers. So I want to make just one note, because sometimes it's confused. That people think that Russian Old Believers are those the Russians that basically were here in 18th, 19th century. They have nothing to do with the Russian-American period of Alaska history. When Alaska was sold in 1867, or purchased in 1867, most of the Russians there lived. Some of them who were married, a native group, they remained in Alaska. Loren Lehman, if you know that, our former lieutenant governor, his grandfather left in Alaska, so he has this kind of connection. But that was only a few individuals like that left, and of course the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Old Believers, basically religious refugees, that arrived, to Oregon first, but then to Alaska in the 1960s. And of course, this is a very unique group. So I will describe the history and ethnography of this group. But then at the end, I want to connect what we learned from the Russian Old Believers and what the lesson we learned in terms of integration of minority groups or assimilation or acculturation into dominant culture. How that Russian Old Believers managed to preserve their traditions and language while they were persecuted for 300 years or basically lived and traveled in not native for them countries. And see that what lesson we can learn, from this group. What you see in the picture, here, it's a well-known painting by the Russian painter Surikov. I believe it is the 19th century, and it's very long, about 20 meters. I just took a fragment of that. And that's a Boyarinya Morozova, one of the noble women who refused to accept new changes that were introduced in the 17th century by Patriarch Nikon. So that was also important to know. Russians would recognize this picture right away because it's in the Tretyakov gallery. It's a very well-known picture, but for you just to know, so it was in a society, in the 17th century, it was kind of very revolutionary event of reformation of the church, and of course, there were two different groups, who wanted to accept it, but didn't. So the history of the Great Schism basically goes back to 1652 and 1666 when the Council of Churches finally approved it. It was approved by Tsar Alexis. And of course it's important to understand the history of Russian non-believers in context of the Russian history. So today I was looking for a method I used to use when I was teaching at the university, but I couldn't find it. So, but just imagine is that there was a key roots, so that basically the Slavic tribes, they accepted the Orthodox religion from Byzantine in 988. And then the key Rus was one of the great states in Europe until the Mongols invaded Slavic tribes or Slavic states, provinces from maybe 1140 to 1480. So for about 250 years there was a Mongol domination, in that area, and that affected the learning and some progress in the life and the history of Slavic states. In addition to that, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire or Turks, they took Byzantine Empire and took Constantinople, and so the Russian Orthodox Church really was sort of separated, from that part of the Europe where they inherited or brought, Orthodox religion to them. So in the course of those, changes in history, the Mongol domination, the Ottoman Empire on one side, and the kind of isolation of Russia for several centuries, many mistakes and errors in translation from the Greek books, to the Russian Slavic Church Slavonic, took place. So sometime in the 16th century, of course, the Tsarist government, was interested at that point to centralize the authority of other provinces around Moscow, and the church played a very important role. So they want to have authority over the church as well, and the proposal was made by Patriarch Nikon and others in the 1650s to make those corrections, in the church books. So for a simple Russian peasants, that was not a very good thing to do. They just basically opposed it, so why we would, change the worship and change some rituals, that we practiced for so many years. So that basically schism controversy took place to the point, what I can read from here, you can see, so that the Russian opposition to Nikon IV insisted that the sign of the cross should be made with two outstretched fingers rather than with three fingers, that the quadrupling of Hallelujah singing the Orthodoxy, the praise of the Lord should be changed twice and not thrice, and so on. You can see that all these categories. But for us, we can say, well, just simple methods, but they were not trivial methods in the Russian society. So basically, that's what the schism, started, and of course, there were many Russian peasants that rebelled or didn't want to accept it. To the point is that sometimes the Russian all-believers, they call themselves true believers, in order to refused to accept those changes would lock themselves in their churches and burn themselves in church, to the death. And when you look on Boyarina Morozova, she was a noble woman, she was quite wealthy, but she basically led the group against those changes. And you see that she holds these two fingers. So when you look in the Russian icon, some of them will be 3 fingers, some of them will be 1, and it has to do with the ritual how the Christ was resurrected. So I'm not going to details of theological aspects, differences of the rational believers and Russian Orthodox Church, because that is really quite a complicated studies. But in this case, the Boyarina Morozova was taken to a stake to be burned for resistance. And the later on, Peter the Great was very well known for persecuting rational believers as well, including his own son, by the way, who conspired apparently against the state, against him. And the Peter the Great, he known in the Russian history for finding out that his son, Alexis, was conspiring against the state, and he was persecuted to the death. The Stalin did the same thing for his son, but in different circumstances. So kind of in Russian history, it's sort of known that the state goes above, that interest of the family action. Now, migration of all believers. So when basically the schism took place in Russia in the 7th century, the rational believers, or those who opposed those changes, they just moved to different areas in the world, different places of the compass, north, south, west. They went to Poland, the Viatka region, where they prospered later on, to Romania, to Turkey, to Baltic region. Some they went to Baikal area, and they would migrate, with larger families to different places and go to remote areas that they could not be reached by others, so they could practice, their religion. And this map shows very well, of rational believers' migration. For example, here you see that many of them went to China, or the area of Trans-Baikal area. But after the revolution of 1917, 1920s, the Soviet government, tolerated religion, but didn't encourage religion. So the old believers, again, were subjected to harsh treatment. So they went to China and formed actually very large communities of Harbin and Xinjiang. The Harbin, for example, population was about 400,000 people in China then. And a third of it, they were rational believers. They spoke Russian. I know some people, my former professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Igor Kopetov, who was born in China and went to a French school, and then they arrived, as an old believer, they arrived to San Francisco and then to Pennsylvania. So, but they were in China until 1949, because then the socialist revolution in China took place, and of course, again, they were not welcome. So that with the support of Council of Churches, I think it's called World Council of Churches, so on, they were able to migrate to Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong, because there's not really much space there, they were able to go to South America, places like Brazil, Bolivia, Peru. That also was not the very good place for them, because they were, in the very Catholic-speaking nations. They were farmers, and so that they practiced a different type of farming. And in fact, many old believers are still there. I met some of them in Argentina when I worked in Argentina, so there is a group, still there. But then in early 1960s, with intervention of Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General then, and Tolstoy Foundation, it's a Russian foundation, Russian old believers managed to, in small group, managed to settle in Oregon. It's a Woodburn community, and in fact, today about 8,000 Russian old believers with 5 sabors. It's a sort of church of prayer halls, still in Woodburn. And in mid-1960s, the most conservative group of rational believers, they also have different tendencies. about 11 of those. It depends from what area they came from. But generally they divide it into priest and priestess, and they don't get along very well, because the priestess is more conservative and the priest kind of is more, I wouldn't call them liberal, but they recognize the priest. So the most conservative group in 1960s, came to Alaska near Anchor Point, and they purchased 1 acre of land in the Kenai Peninsula, what is now village Nikolaevsk. It was 5 families, and basically established the village. And that's not uncommon for the Russian old believers. They they established in Alaska about 10 villages. Some small of them in the Kenai Peninsula, 4 or 5. In Ivilo, north of Anchorage, there's another one called Berezovka. And I believe even in Aleutian Islands there is a small settlement. And it's kind of easy for them to establish those villages because their family have about 5 to 10 children. All they have to do, 5 families, to move to one location, build a couple of houses, and then the state is required to build a school, because they have already 20, 25 children. So for them it's not a very difficult matter to move and to migrate. But it was interesting how they established, in the Kenai Peninsula, they lived in tents, and as in my conversation with them, the tent was burned, the child died in the course of that. Was a tragic event. So they were sort of pioneers to some degree in that area. And another group went to Canada, in Alberta. There also village also called Berezovka, because Bereza is a birch, so they name after the woods or trees, the forest they lived in. And the most conservative live in Alaska, this group. And here's the map, basically most of them in the Kenai Peninsula. I always had a difficult time to figure out how many of them live in Alaska in terms of numbers. I know that Nikolaevsk is the largest village, it's about 400 individuals live there. Will be about 80 to 70 families, the families are large. But somebody told me that it's about 2,000 Russian old believers living in Alaska. So basically the first Russian speaking after Alaska was sold that came to Alaska and received their United States citizenship in 1973 or 75. There was a big article on National Geographic when they did it. But when I went to Alaska, there is no longer a sign like that. That was a sign in entrance. Village of Nikolaevsk, private property, road closed. So I parked my car just before I introduced myself. And so I took several pictures of 1983, and of course, I have more contemporary pictures, but I think from historic point of view, those pictures are, more significant. So when you look on the village of Nikolaevsk, probably, just modern homes, with some homes that will reflect sort of northern environment or Slavic Russian, architecture. But the first what is important for the Russian old believers is to recognize the differences in their practices, religious practices. Basically it's a Popovtsi priest and priestess. Within those groups there is other tendencies. And when I arrived to Alaska, to Nikolaevsk in 1983, I already noticed some tension between priest and priestess. Apparently, Kondraty Fifelov, who went to Romania, that brought with him new ideas. He wanted to become a priest, so he started basically this new tendency or group of a priest group. There were several families in that village. And I remember walking with Martushев on the street, and when he walked by priest group, he just took a cross in his hand, because it wasn't his way of doing it. And the 5 families, were so offended, by the presence of another group, so they decided to build a new village in Ivilo. And that's what basically all believers do. They exercise a strategy, what I, basically concluded later on, of rational preselection or rejection, done by the elders. They have support, elected individuals, the older people, who would basically decide what to do, what not to do, whom to accept, whom not to accept. The migration would be another strategy. If they feel that they're threatened by something new and offensive, they would migrate, like this group did. And another would be boundary maintenance, meaning they will be very careful who comes to their place in their village. And certain things they do, for example, when I would be invited to eat a dinner, my dishes would be separate from them. And they would be plastic, so they can get rid of them. And if they will use regular dishes, they will wash them in a different sink. So when I took my assistants with them, I had 3 assistants over the years, we would not wash our hands, we would not use their toilet facilities, because they would just simply just take a sink and get rid of it. The most conservative group. But you have to see the reason of that. It's not a matter of hygiene, it's a matter of they believe that true believers doesn't want to be contaminated with somebody who are not. It's basically protecting their identity that way. So, but anyway, go back to this story. I noticed that tension, and of course, 2 years later, this building was burned. It's a prayer hall for priests. Anchorage Daily News in 1985 reported in this newspaper. In fact, I don't have it in newspaper in their archives. I'm the only one who has it. That basically said what constitutes, well, the defense of the United States. But there was a big article on rational believers, what happened in the village. Actually, a nice article. I should scan it and keep it for historic purposes. I found the only one who has the newspaper. That Fifila was accused because he built his church, a priest's church, just across the street from the place when the prayer hall was burned. And of course, that the priestless group, they point the finger to him. He said, he did it. He said, no, I didn't. So basically, investigation was done. It wasn't proven he did it or he didn't. But the Kondraty Fifila was one of the radical fellow. He wouldn't mind to meet with me and sing his songs, and basically, he had a television in his house that then in 1980s, the Russian believers didn't want a television or radio or kind of sources of information. Now they do. But then he had it. And of course, he had enough money. He came from Bolivia. I believe he was probably a millionaire. He made lots of money. And so he was one who said, no, we cannot live in isolation. Our belief, our faith has nothing to do with our behavior, that we just don't want the outside world come to us. So they will come anyway, so may as well we adapt to this. And but that was his philosophy, and of course I worked with him, with a priest group, and I worked with the priests. There was not much differences in theological aspect of that, except, that the last time I met him, we were at the table eating a dinner, and I was shocked that I ate a dinner from the same plate, I could take it from there. And he was drinking wine. Normally they don't. They make their own Braga wine made of berries. And of course, as Russians, they have a tendency to overdo it sometimes. So in that case, and I've seen it, so in that case, the wives would hide the keys, the car keys, from them, because, they would drive and, wreck the car, do something like that. So that would be known in the village. The household and subsistence activities basically very much resemble sort of a Siberian 19th, 18th century in some places. That would be an example of what it would look like, in the 18th, 19th century, the household. And that was Martushev and Basargin. Basargin passed away, who is to the left. Martushev, I do not know what happened to him now, but basically these two fellows met me that day in 1983, and they introduced me to their village. So I already had a contact. But when you look at this picture, it could be anywhere in a rural area with all sorts of animals around. The old believers, at least then, and very conservative now, would not purchase food from supermarket except the flour, sugar, and salt. They try to secure their own food. In fact, when I was working for Alaska Department of Education, I would take my students to close-up program to Washington, D.C. And sometimes I would meet students, kind of all together, different schools. I would meet the students from Nikolaevsk, meaning from old believers. So the parents would give enough food to eat for a week. It would be kielbasa, sausages, maybe a little bread. And they would come to cafeteria where all these close-up students, and maybe just to drink orange juice or water or something like that. And so this basically tells you that all believers try to be self-sufficient and to produce their own food for the purposes is that their religion, for the conservative group, do not allow them to accept food from outside. They can share it with you. They will give it to you, but they will not take it from you because the reasons that that they want to be pure. Architecture, I have better pictures in my book. There it was translated into Russian by the Russian embassy. That English version is out of print, unfortunately. So if you want to acquire the book, you will have very nice pictures at least. You can read it Russian, but you have pictures. But this house I took again, 1983, and again you can see it resembles a little bit, and they like to have veranda. They have a little bit architecture, sort of Slavic or Russian type. But mostly houses, they basically all one-story houses. Some of them without foundation. Some of them two-story houses now. But when you look on others, you will see there will be greenhouses, like for example this one, because they have to have their own gardening. And what they do for subsistence, they hunt the fish. They sign the contracts, and many of them are fishermen, very aggressive fishermen. I remember American fishermen complain about the Russians. They said because they speak Russian, they curse on the radio, and they just aggressively go to the places sometimes, not in the area where they should be. But also, this is a shipbuilding company. They used to build their own boats, and very powerful boats. So they stopped doing it, but they had two shipbuilding places where they were doing that. And that's one of my visits, 1989. I took with me an assistant who is in the green shirt, Miriam Lancaster. She was a nurse. Certain questions I could not ask because I could not ask questions related to health of women. She could, and she did a marvelous job because she was an anthropologist plus a nurse working for federal government. I cannot release this data. She doesn't want me to release the data because the names and the privacy issue. But maybe one day I will be able, maybe 20 years from now, so that she did a wonderful job in questioning the younger people and women. And of course, in the household, it's nothing different than contemporary house. And this is Solomia. I don't know if she's still alive, but Kalugina. And she just was an encyclopedia of cooking. This is her cookbook. I purchased that for $5. But this is 17th century, cooking. I'm telling you, this is. And she had 11 children. And she was like, people pass the folklore or tales from one generation to another. But she was the one passing the recipes to her children for one generation. It was all in the head. And when you sit in her house and she's performing, suddenly the phone call and her daughter is calling and she said, well, you need to take 3 eggs, mix it together, then put something else. And she basically tell her, those 17th century recipe. Finally, the children convinced her to write the book. And of course, in her house, you have to know how to conduct yourself, not to violate, the rules. So the food, non-believer guests treated very hospitality, but fed separately. And you can see their clothing. And I will go now quickly because I think the time sort of, we still have 20 minutes. Appearance of Russian nobility is very Slavic. And the children clothes, this is a 1930s, so you will see that there's not really many changes, from then to now. The Basargin, this little girl, she is Selezneva now, and she works in Oregon for bilingual education. She met me at the embassy, and she looked at my book and said, oh, it's me. I didn't recognize her, obviously, because so many years later, she's an older woman. But she was standing with her glass of wine in the embassy. They should not drink wine. She knew that she is violating things. But, of course, they're traditional, but it does mean that sometimes they go out and put a manicure or pedicure. I see them doing, so that they do that. This is the Kalugins family, and now when they talk about appearance, the clothing, 2 elements are extremely important for them, the belt and the cross. The belt, they only take it off when they go to bed or wash it. Cross, they never take it off, only when they replace the chain. And a short could be another element they like, to have that. So you ask a question, why the appearance and language? basically they speak Russian language in the families, are so important elements in their culture that even that they for 300 years do not live in their native land, Australia, New Zealand, South America, Oregon, but they still preserve the language. And you ask a question, why that many native groups that live in their historical land lose their language and traditions? So what does the All Believers do that our policymakers, should learn, from it? What behavioral mechanism they choose or that help them to preserve their traditions and integration with the society? So that's her daughter Ulita. She was about 24, 25 years old. She couldn't find a suitor. The reason is that mostly the people who were around her were priestess, and she was priest. So finally she found a suitor, and she was quite old because the woman married in this society about 14, 16 years old, and the man about 16 to 20. They married very early and entered adulthood, and adult responsibility also in a very early age so they can stay out of the troubles. Finally, she found a suitor in Australia, and I guess, her mother was not happy because she said the man drinks a lot and there's a lot of problems in the family. But you can see that what she is wearing, her mother, I want to go back, wore talichka, and that's not very traditional, it basically adapted clothes, but she wore the sarafan. I'm not going to detail of that, but it's when you go to the village today, it's not uncommon to see the Russian All Believers wearing their own clothes with a great pride. Well, that's me actually. I was very younger then, so that I was, and in fact, the Russian All Believers, the women, they, in the course of the years, they sew things for themselves and keep it in the trunk. It's like a diary. When they get married, the man has to buy, basically symbolically buying. And the woman should have a trunk of goods, just to contribute to a family household. And they have a patrilineal society, so meaning the woman, when they get married, they go to man's household. Very much like a Chinese, by the way. There is a kind of buying and giving. There's sort of ceremonies goes on. And that's a children's clothes, of course. Those people, of course, the kids, they're already adults. Their appearance is very much Slavic. And those kids, I think I made this picture either 2001 or before. And there's another picture is interesting. Yeah, I'll go back to this. It's very much Slavic, appearance, although they don't mix very much with others, only with their own. The only that if they married and the person is not All Believer, they have to be converted to All Believers. One of the teachers who taught in Nikolaev school, he was All Believer, but he was American. In fact, I interviewed him too. He knew a great deal of that. And they do not mind, because when they live in Siberia for a long time, many political exiles who came in Siberia, they intermarried with Russian All Believers. And of course, there was made this arrangement. The All Believers have about 200 days in a year they fast. They have 38 religious holidays. And it doesn't last one day. It's from 1 to 3 to 5, whatever the holidays are. So the school system had to make adjustments. And in Alaska, we do a very, very good job in doing that. For example, school in Nikolaevsk, in addition to 11 regular days, they're given to every student in the state, they added 12 religious holidays for the Russian All Believers. I don't know exactly how they signed the contracts because they still have to, it's a public school, how they do it. But they made this accommodation, but also in the curriculum. For example, the school board consists mostly of All Believers, and they have to make sure that offensive subjects are not taught. In 1983, when I checked the library, they had no Russian classic literature in the library. I checked the library later, 20 years later, they had some. So there are changes, in their schooling system. And I remember working for the Department of Education, the subject was introduced in the state that was required, the health-related subject, and was some aspects of the sex education that would not work for the Russian All Believers. And I believe, I suggested that to the commissioner then, and I don't think they teach that particular aspect or evolution, or certain aspects in the biology. It's not uncommon for parents to withdraw their children from the school in the 6th grade, and they start work early. So that's interesting conversation between Miriam Lancaster and this lady, whom I forgot her name, Kalugin's family. And she was very ambitious. She wanted to go to college. And in fact, the parents, do not deny them today. If they want to go to college and get a profession, they would allow them to do that. So marriage and wedding ceremonies, there's a certain process, and here I work with Fifela to figure out the kinship. They can marry only with a 4th generation apart, so that he has to calculate in the book what is a relationship of a bride and a groom, and to allow this marriage to take place so there is proper mixture of those things. So basically I figured out the kinship, relationship in the family. Education, language, schooling. This is a village, they have about 140 students there, mostly Russian. They would always have 2 or 3, Russian language teachers. And of course, the Americans who are in this school, they also study Russian, and they're in the Russian environment. These are not all believers. There's American kids, probably children of the teachers who are there, but this is a Russian old believer, and he studies Russian there. And because of the many religious holidays, sometimes that the siblings stay home, with the older children stay home with the siblings, and they miss school, and of course in Nikolaevsk, they're very tolerant and understanding, of this tradition. So I want to compare that who are the Russian non-believers. They are basically religious refugees, who came to Alaska. And in fact, for the first time in all these 350 years travels, they found Alaska as a heaven. Because we are experienced in working and dealing with all sorts of native indigenous groups in Alaska. So we respect and understand, those groups. And the Russian non-believers, obviously, our justice system, our education system, we understand this group. In fact, the principal then in 1980s, his name I think was Richard Moore, he was like a gatekeeper. He would not allow other people to come and kind of intrude in the life of the Russian non-believers. So, they're prospering in many different ways in Alaska, and found, their freedom to exercise their rights and religion rights. And my question was, well, how they can be compared with a lot of religious refugees? Amish group. Well, then I was in Pennsylvania, I studied at Bryn Mawr College, so I was able to go to Lancaster and to work with a little bit with Amish groups. They don't know nothing about the Russian non-believers, but they exercise to some degree the same principle. Language is important for them to speak in the community. Appearance must be a certain that will represent their ethnic group. The differences would be with, let's say, Hutterites, Duchabors, Jewish Orthodox groups in New York or somewhere else, or Amish, is that Amish are in competition with technology. They don't drive, they do certain things. All believers there no. All believers will accept technology. That in 1980s, they would be reluctant to use the television or radio. Today, probably they do. I'm sure that they have all sorts of telephones. That didn't change. But the religion for the Russian old believers defines, their behavior, defines, their identity, defines, what they do in their life, with whom they marry, the role of women, the role of children. It's their core values. It's a core value of their society. And that's what they don't want to lose, because they feel if they're going to lose they're basically will not be the same people as they think of themselves. And one interesting group just show you, to what extreme the Russian believers had to go, in order to preserve, their traditions. In 1980s in Siberia, just by incident, one group, in geologist group, did some the survey, and they found, wait a minute, this is not in the map. Suddenly there's a garden in the taiga, in the Lena River. What river it was? I think it's Abakan River. So they landed, and finally they found a little house that should not be there, and finally they found the people who basically for 50 years isolated themselves in the taiga of Siberia, lived there.
And of course, you know, it was a very difficult living, and I knew the journalist who wrote the book. He came to Alaska, and I hosted him in Peskov. He just passed away several months ago in Russia. They kind of took these people from Taiga, brought them to Moscow. I don't know if they did good or bad, but the entire family within several months, you know, just die out, or either of viruses or stress or whatever that was the issue. But you know, that to me it was a very interesting example, you know, what the old believers went through in order to preserve their tradition. They just would go far in the taiga, and the same thing would be in Bukhtarmin village in Altai Mountains when I visited them. Unfortunately, none of this survived, even the child. But you know, that's implements that they used for many years. They were wore out completely. And the most interesting for me was they were writing in Church Slavonic. It's kind of old Russian language, very illiterate, but I can read it, but with great difficulties. Now, now I want to make a connection here. You know, because for me, there's a number of questions could be asked. You know, the first of all, what can we learn from the Russian old believers, you know, in order to help to preserve our indigenous population languages and traditions? You know, what a policymaker should do or should not do, what the people themselves. It could be very offensive to Native people. 12 years ago, I presented in a conference, and I had 6 believers in the audience, and I had some Alaska Natives in the audience. And when I made this statement, you know, one of Yupik, you know, stood up and said, "You offended me." I said, "How?" I said that we were not allowed to speak our language, that we had to wash our mouths. And all believers, you know, sitting there said, "Well, but you are persecuted and killed." You know, so I didn't have to answer his question. I just apologized. I said, "I didn't mean to offend you. Just want to see that what the connection we have to make." So that's the one area that policymakers and maybe natives could look at, but also the issue of integration. Sometimes it's a very misunderstood concept, because integration is sort of a one-way street. You know, integration is a minorities or smaller group integrate with a dominant culture. But it's a very complex process. It doesn't happen the same way in the same group or different groups. I integrated in much different way, you know, because I separated from the Russian community in the early stages than my sister or my family is in Philadelphia. My daughter was born in Juna. Her mother was, you know, American born, so she's completely assimilated. So we have to make a distinction between integration and assimilation. And all believers, they're born mostly in the United States now, but you know, their integration process to dominant culture, you know, is different than, I would say, for those immigrants who come from other places. So we have to look on a different kind of level of integration, and not to confuse this with assimilation. The integration, full integration will never happen, you know, because your prior background and culture will still play the role in your speaking, in your behavior, and so on and so on. And in a different group in a different ways. Assimilation will only happen, maybe, with the first generation. And it's not only in the United States, it's also in Europe and so on and so on. So from that point of view, if you're a demographer or sociologist, I think there are old believers is a good case to study, you know, to see what can be derived from point of view, you know, that for policymakers, you know, how to see that what is it they do, you know, to keep the coherence and cohesiveness in their society. All right, well, thank you very much.
I just want to say, you know, I have all of Alexander's books, and they are phenomenal. They're so interesting, and they make wonderful presents. I just really appreciate you coming and speaking.
Thank you.
I agree.